To Myanmar now, protests against the February 1 coup that overthrew elected government of the veteran democracy campaigner Aung San Suu Kyi have shown no sign of dying down. Opponents of Myanmar's coup took to the streets again today with members of ethnic minorities among those coming out in demanding an end to military rule and the release of Suu Kyi and others. For more on this, I'm joined by Shabnam Mayet, advocate and co-founder of Protect the Rohingyas. A very good afternoon to you and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So what are the latest updates that you actually can give us on the protest situation and perhaps arrests that have been made in Myanmar?
So for 2 weeks now, protesters have been coming to the streets in the most amazing ways. Doctors, students, lawmakers. There have been initiatives to hack military websites. The police, of course, the military has been deployed, and the military has met some of the protesters with force using water cannons. There's also massive deployment of troops in and around areas where protesters are. There have been nighttime raids. Over 500 people have now been arrested. The first person who was killed, a protester who was shot in the head last week, succumbed to her injuries just today. But Generation Z has come out in the most amazing ways against this protest. Of course, international outcry has been there as well. The US, the UK, all giving sanctions on military leaders, specific ones, offers to freeze assets. New Zealand has stopped high-level bilateral talks. Mm-hmm. So things are happening. Unfortunately, from South Africa's side, as usual, not much has happened apart from a small statement which condemns the violence and also speaks about returning to the rule of law. The problem with returning to the rule of law in Myanmar right now is that it's based on the 2008 military constitution, which gives the military 25% of seats in parliament.
Now, just going back to the protester who you said succumbed to head injuries, was it live ammunition that was fired at her or was it a rubber bullet to the head?
There have been rubber bullets fired, but they found that the specific case was live ammunition. The other problematic thing that has happened is that in a pardon, 23,000 prisoners have been released last week from prison. Some say it's to make space for protesters, but the problem is a lot of these there have been reports of prisoners stirring up trouble in communities, and communities have started nighttime community policing. So there is a problem, obviously, and that's quite dangerous.
And what are some of the charges that have been laid against the over 500 people who have been arrested so far?
So we know that even with the leader Aung San Suu Kyi and Win Myint, who is the prime minister, what they've said is that there were COVID laws that they didn't obey. They also said that she was in possession of 6 walkie-talkies. The problem you must remember is that as a military dictatorship for over 5 decades, there are a lot of repressive laws in the country, and so there are many laws under which protesters can be arrested. Also, right now they're trying to push the cyber bill because, as you know, since the protests began, they've been cutting the internet. Protesters have been using VPNs and SMS groups and calling different areas once every hour to find out if everyone is safe. And they found many alternative ways to get around it. But internet has dropped to 21% of what it usually is. And the military is trying to pass this cybersecurity bill very quickly. And internet companies are speaking out against it, as well as activists around the world.
A lot of inhibition there of freedom of speech. Now, the military in their statement claimed that about 40 million out of 53 million citizens actually support the coup. What's your position on this? What actually is the truth from those that are on the ground and have access to platforms like this where you can tell us what the military won't tell us?
So you must remember that the NLD, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, won the November election in more than an 83% landslide. And the military started this whole coup under the false pretenses of that there were problems with the election, right? While minority areas couldn't vote and there were other issues, an 83% landslide victory is enough to show that this is what the people want. And if this is what the people wanted, then the military wouldn't have to deploy troops and cut out the internet. And people have been coming to the streets in their numbers all over the country. So, and ethnic minorities as well, because the one thing the military has done is it's been responsible for the Rohingya genocide in 2017. And you see a lot of minorities coming out, speaking out against military brutality against them, and a few boards of the protesters even saying they're sorry about what happened to the Rohingya and they didn't understand at that stage. So I think it's definitely from what the UN is saying, from what Rohingya in the diaspora is saying, and the thousands and hundreds of thousands of protesters, it's pretty obvious that this is not what they want.
And being someone who has contact with those on the ground and being in the country, can you actually confirm that those November 8th elections that saw Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy party actually get that landslide victory were free and fair elections?
So the Union Electoral Commission themselves said that there was no problem in terms of the military's complaints. The Union Electoral Commission said they didn't even take those forward. And international observers of the elections, for everyone, these elections were the will of the people. You must remember that it's very recent that the country is free from the military, maybe like just 2011. And so people came out in their numbers to vote, and the hundreds of thousands of protesters in the streets say to us that, this is not what they wanted. They didn't want another military coup. They've suffered under two brutal military coups in the past before. And this group of protesters have gone past what has happened in the past, where the military has come out in brute force and shooting protesters and things like that. Now, because of social media and the international interest, these protesters have found very novel ways to tell the international community what's happening to them. They've been protesting in front of embassies. They've been, very vocal online. There's been a lot of footage coming out, and I suppose the military has had to be more careful in terms of the force that it uses. But this hasn't stopped it from actually, doing those night raids, arresting many people. And as the military gets more frustrated with the fact that it's not supported at all, perhaps it will become even more and more brutal in the coming days.
And the military actually does have a history of violence as well as impunity. And I'm just wondering, with more and more of these mass protests being organized, more troops as well being organized, as you mentioned, these nighttime raids, are we likely to see violence that will sort of border towards the genocidal violence that we saw in years past?
No, we'd like to hope not. We'd like to hope that the international eye on the situation and the international moves to stop the military from taking brutal action will be successful. But the military has a lot of support and it has a lot of money. Two of the military conglomerates own a lot of assets in the country. In fact, just last week, the U.S. is freezing around $1 billion, that the military owns in the U.S. And so who knows what the military will do, but I think it's up to the international community now to make sure that they take, a really strong stance and very practical steps against the military.
And just speaking about the intervention of the international community, you mentioned earlier on US President Joe Biden has mentioned sanctions. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also mentioned in one of his tweets that the detention of the leaders and the protesters actually violates their human rights and that those responsible for this coup have to be held to account. Do these commitments from the international community actually bring you comfort? And has the military responded at all to those threats of sanctions?
The thing is, the military still has many friends in the region, and that's, China, Russia have been vetoing steps at the UN level. And so what needs to happen, I suppose, is the ASEAN needs to take some steps. And South Africa signed on to an amity and cooperation agreement with ASEAN last November. And perhaps that could allow us and countries who have those kinds of relations to also put pressure on the regional bloc to then put pressure on Myanmar.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We do hope that all that violence will come to an end soon. That was Shabnam Mayet, who is the advocate and co-founder of Protect the Rohingya.